new series on inspirations at work. Michael, it's nice to have you with me today. Michael Walton is a senior lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Director for Economic Development Research and Strategy at Imago Global Grassroots. Today, I wanted to talk to you about your journey, the conception of adaptive evaluation, and Imago's work in the adaptive evaluation space. And I know this is a space that's emerging and very much becoming important in Imago. So I'm very glad to have you here today, and thanks for being with us, Michael. Great. So I'm going to step back for a moment and start with your journey. So tell me about the moment you first heard about the idea of Imago. Where were you in your personal and professional life then? And what was the core idea of Imago and its early inception?
Yes, well, great to be here to have this discussion. I think what I'd like to do is actually step back a couple of steps earlier and to see how I got into this kind of work we do in Imago. And as I reflected on this, I realized that some of the impulse goes back actually many decades before I got into development work. That I grew up in a small town in England, and even then there emerged some interest in social engagement, and I would work in summers in sort of relatively poor housing estates or work with primary school kids. And then I got kind of interested, in fact, passionate about issues of economic development, but very much through the world of ideas and policy. And while my first job was actually working for the government of Lesotho in a poor country in Africa. And at that point, while I was working in the Central Planning and Development Office, I also would really like to visit villages, try to work on potential participatory engagement in the villages. But I was young and naive and hopeful then. And then there was a kind of long diversion into policy work in the World Bank, and not really a diversion. It was just an engagement in thinking about policy, doing analysis, which then continued when I left for the last 17 years, been teaching. That again, I was teaching very much economic development, policy ideas, how you take understanding of the world to policy. So that was, but all the way through this, I had the feeling that I love this work, but I would really like to be more directly engaged with the people, the communities that I was thinking about, writing about, doing analysis of. Because I was always interested in poverty, inequality, in social movements, in social capital, but I was never actually really engaged. So that was the context. And then when Imago emerged and Isabel Guerrero had the idea, kind of parallel impulse to, there's so much exciting happening in the grassroots, but we weren't directly engaging. It kind of, it emerged as a kind of intention, as an intention to explore and try to engage more directly in community. So that was how I first felt and heard and engaged with Imago, as an exciting impulse, but very much as an exploration.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to know, what was it about Imago that struck you as different from your years of experience in development, and what are some of the core values you think define Imago?
Oh, it was absolutely going to where groups at the in the grassroots, to go to where they were in the spirit of discovery, in the spirit of, is there anything we can do to help? And taking from the beginning the idea of co-creation seriously. So in a way, we had the hypothesis that there was that a groups, and of course, absolutely formative for me and for others, was the Self-Employed Women's Association of India. We kind of discovered what was meant by going to work with the grassroots, going to work with an organization of the poor, through working with them. And we spent summers working with them with lots of time. And that was where I think we were exploring the hypothesis that we had lots of experience thinking about development, doing policy, and that there was a potential complementarity, even though we went in absolutely not with the expert opinion. The expert opinion that you tend to adopt, whether you're working for the World Bank that I'd left in 2004, or in a way, as a teacher of policy, there's very much that kind of arrogance of the expert. We have the best analysis. We're going to give you good policy. And that's a very arrogant position. This is kind of jumping ahead. But while we embraced the approach of co-creating, of going to where other organizations are fully, we came to learn as we worked over time with more and more organizations that for us, there's actually a specific skill of navigating between the humility of going to discover where are you, what are you doing, what's going on, to stepping back, okay, and this is what we think, to bring, because we felt a demand that for what's your expert opinion, and that's a skill I think we have developed over time.
Yeah, it's always great to hear the journey and where you started, and also what makes Imago what it is. But I'm going to move ahead, and I wanted to ask you, one of the things you've been working on in the past few years is a different kind of evaluation, what we call an adaptive evaluation. So for an audience that is unfamiliar with the term, how would you describe an adaptive evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a quick description, and then I'll come back to how I came to kind of, what you might call discover it. So the quick description is that an adaptive evaluation is an evaluation that is designed to work with complex problems as they unfold and evolve, to engage with questions for which you're not testing one specific hypothesis, that aren't suited to a kind of lab-like setting. I'm going to come to RCTs in a moment, but the lab-like setting that RCTs seek to replicate in-field experiments, and they're complex because of the unpredictability of human behavior, because you're working in a complex interacting system, or very importantly, a key dimension of how we think about and are practicing adaptive evaluation, complementing the process of design and discovery during the intervention process. And I'd love to expand on that, but I wanted to step back about how kind of I got into it, how we got into it. And actually, there are two really formative parts of that. One actually was the first RCT that I was involved in, which was an RCT of Pratham, an extraordinary non-government education group that works to discover, design, and scale pedagogic innovations to tackle the basic learning problem, the basic learning deficit in India, and to scale through government. So now about, I would guess when I went to live in India about 14 years ago, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo invited me to work with them as a PI on the project. And that was an incredibly formative experience, partly to be in an RCT, and that's super interesting. But what I really discovered in that is how important the relationship between the evaluators and the implementers were. And in fact, Abhijit especially had built and then brought Esther in, built this relationship with Pratham such that the questions of design were actually emerging jointly very much from Pratham. And then in the process of implementation, where I was working a lot with Rukmini Banerjee, who was then now the CEO of Pratham, then was leading the whole knowledge side within Pratham, how the RCT itself first needed a lot of complementary work. And since I was living in India, we could actually add qualitative work on how the system functioned, qualitative work about how the pedagogy, which is a very specific pedagogy of, they call it teaching at the right level now, it had a different name then, was taking a way of organizing the schooling day to match the pedagogy to the learning level of the children. How that you needed to understand that in the context of teacher behavior, how teachers were recruited, how some of the new teachers were actually recruited by the bottom level of government, and actually there was some power relations there. And so we did some qualitative work on that. That's one thing I learned from this RCT. The other thing I learned was actually the RCT was like a punctuated moment in a long series of exploration that Pratham was running. Pratham's an extraordinary learning organization. It's in their DNA, a product of very much the founders of Pratham, but now spreading through the whole system. So they would be following a process of exploration, design in the field, tracking, quick discovery of what happens next. And then now and again, they would say, okay, here's something where we think a specific structured evaluation is going to help us. Partly help us, help us as in help Pratham, partly help us because now we think there's one hypothesis or two hypotheses that we really want to test, not at full scale, but at kind of medium scale. And frankly, also tactically. Tactically, RCT bringing in distinguished professors. This is way before the Nobel Prize, but that gave them credibility and actually big fights they were having about how to tackle this problem. So that was the second thing I discovered, that they were in what I would now call a process of adaptive design and evaluation, and we're working with them on that. The second really big influence, one was actually, I can think of it especially in the work on SEWA, that we were doing in other places too, is in that process of going to discover where you are, we started bringing in techniques, and our whole approach in Imago is, we see a technique there, let's try it and adapt it to our, and so I can think of 2 to 3 techniques that we use. One was the use of clickers, polls, which we would take and we would use them as a quick response assessment where we'd work up like quick questionnaires and use that with, we used it with SEWA's board, we would use it in the big groups of SEWA women in the villages. And that, what I was discovering is here's something that I'd used in the classroom, that I learned from the classroom. These were often illiterate women, and this is the technique we used, we actually would hand out little clickers for them to do it. And I found, oh, well, this is actually a process of exploration, which also had another attribute, that the women loved it. And they loved it because, partly because it's anonymous, and partly because they could immediately see the results, because we would show it either on the computer or on a screen, and then they could have a discussion about it. So we'd think of it as a kind of structured focus group. And that led me to a further kind of intuitive understanding that we're actually in a participatory exploratory process in which we didn't call it an evaluation, but in this evaluation process, it's also deeply reciprocal. So that was one thing. Another thing that we kind of just picked up, we observed, we were helping somebody from the Parsons School, also in India, and they had a neat technique, playing with Legos to do what we now call system mapping. So we watched it and thought, that's great. And we started using it. We made it to a way of actually how to build a view of the system by the group in ways that they can then understand, look at the reciprocal relationships amongst the key stakeholders. And we discovered that that visual, well, we didn't even call it design thinking, but a design thinking tool was incredibly powerful as an interpretive organizational assessment tool. And that was another thing, that the idea that you have to systematically understand the system using a variety of tools around that was critical to laying the basis for any kind of evaluation. So this is some of how we got into this, and then we began to see the need for actually more structured reflection and interpretation of what was happening in these interventions. And probably the first that Imago did, because when we went in, even though I come from a kind of teaching and research background, we deliberately weren't thinking we're doing research, because we wanted absolutely to avoid the principle, we are coming to analyze you. We are coming to extract information for you. We're going to interpret what you're doing. So that was the principle. And that one of the key areas that we worked with was working with one of Sewa's social enterprises. It's called Rudy. It is a kind of where the social enterprise procures spices and other agricultural products, processes them, and then Sewa members become actually the frontline agents, and actually they receive a return based on how much they sell. When we, long story about how we got involved, we worked at all different levels. We're working with the questions of the identity of the frontline agents, which really is getting into kind of some kind of cultural and psychological issues of awareness of, because they were holding two identities. One, that we're part of a movement, and the other that I am selling something for which I earn. But these identities were not recognized in how the organization was structured. So we were working on that. We also worked at the board level. And then we wrote, after working 2 to 3 years on this, a kind of retrospective on this, which in which what we realized that we were doing is kind of applied really action research, the participatory action research that included identity elements, which is pretty unstructured. We've never tried to publish it because it wasn't very systematic. We've got a paper on it, but that I think these sources led us, me and others, to the view that actually there is a different way of doing evaluation. You can do it seriously, you can do it objectively. Participation, quant and qual is all important, and that we need to do this in a very structured way.
It's wonderful to hear how ideas come to be and how they slowly grow into something that becomes, it was nice to hear. There were a lot of things you said that caught my attention. So there was a lot of things you described as an exploration or learning. The other thing that I heard a lot was on participation, on making things more participatory. And so I was curious. So in an adaptive, what do you think is different about an adaptive evaluation relative to the more conventional impact evaluations we see? What distinguishes it in some sense?
The first thing, I think we can answer that in 2 ways, is what are we trying to answer? And then how do we do it? What are we trying to answer is we're trying to answer problems that are complex, as in the sense that as we just as I said before, that you've got a complex interacting system where you cannot separate one hypothesis, have a treatment and control group, and hold those and then test the hypothesis over time. So, and there are many questions. A lot of the most interesting questions in development, the toughest questions, even what seem like questions that are more, we call technical, like how do you get kids in school to learn basic skills? How do you get frontline government workers, whether it's extension agents, people in the police, teachers, mobilizers for women's groups, how do you understand, you get alignment between their behavior on the state-society interface? These are all complex questions. Yes, you can pick one hypothesis, hold things still. There's lots of great RCTs that do that. But when you're engaged in seeking to solve a complex problem, we believe you need different techniques for that. Now, the interesting question is, how do you do that whilst preserving accountability and using structured and rigorous is, I'm hesitant to use rigorous because sometimes rigorous is used in a very specific sense. It's sometimes used statistically, can you have statistically identified causation? That's one use of rigorous. But by us, we mean undertake the evaluation in a structured and disciplined way where you pick techniques that are applicable to the case in hand. And that can range from, which is very important actually, in theory always matters, but the theorization of what's going on as part of the process is particularly important in an adaptive evaluation because precisely because you are often not got the equivalent of a treatment and control. You're looking through messy changes over time. You have to, with interactions where your theory and the question of what is consistent with your theory and what is not is really important. And for that, we use techniques like maps of the causal system, always spending a lot of time in description, looking at the range of literature, interpreting whether it's human, enterprise, or government behavior to build the structural causation in what we call causal maps. Then we often use a standard tool, which is the log frame, the logic model, which is a linearization from cause to effect, intervention, output, down through outcomes and impacts, but typically it's very useful linearization because that gives you the structure to assess, okay, and this is your hypothesis in terms of your theory, this is what you're doing, and then we can ask questions like, what would constitute support in terms of what you observe for your theory, what would reject it, what would be consistent with it, what would be consistent with another theory. This is a kind of intuitive description of one technique called process tracing. Sometimes we can be working, and there may be choices of comparing, like A/B testing that use a lot in the tech sector and in some other sectors, where you've got two often similar designs and run them against each other. They can be with randomization or not, but you can still get information from that. Now, this is just an illustration of some of the things that are useful in an adaptive evaluation. Now, building your interpretation of the system, your interpretation of the theory of change can be done just from outside in at least the caricature of investigative work, but it's typically more fruitfully done in a participatory way because there's incredible knowledge in the system of the actors. And what it does is, I think, is put in this case, the evaluator in a position of ensuring that the kind of accountability is based on their integrity and the process, because the participatory element is often extremely fruitful for both designing and for interpretation. And we're not going to go into, I don't want to go into detail on techniques, but I mean, another technique we discovered recently is outcome harvesting, which is a technique, and there's a whole lot of people do this, which for us is actually working in a participatory way to retrospective interpret what's happening. Well, for us, I think of it as retrospective process tracing, but that's just, and then of course you have to do your careful work, some which may be qualitative, some may be econometric, some may lead to hypotheses that then you test in the next round prospectively, working with the partners. So this is to highlight that there is a set of techniques that, it's a family of techniques that we use in an adaptive evaluation, that they don't actually have to be participatory, but it's going to be much more, that is not only Imago's principle, but I think it tends to be much more effective and efficient if there's a lot of participation. Since, especially when you get to questions of adaptive design, which is one of the great, I think, strengths of an adaptive evaluation, you have to work very closely with the implementation side. That very importantly involves mutual understanding, and something which is also very Imago actually, it has to involve the building of trust. Because if there's any question of trying to find a good result that makes you look good, you may as well give up then. And so we always build understandings based on that. And I think it's quite interesting that two of our big adaptive evaluations we're working on in India. One is with Sewa on their enterprises, and one is actually on government programs, but where the key designer of the program is actually Transform Rural India. And in both cases, we've been, Imago, and I personally, have been working with them for many years. Now, we're just exploring work in Brazil, which we haven't got approved yet. But I think there and there was tremendous interest we found in Brazil, including the education sector, on an adaptive evaluation, because they recognize, look, these are exploratory. We're going to do a lot of design exploration. We don't know the answers. One possibility is actually taking what Pratham did in India. Will that work in Brazil or not? And I think there what we've done, we're new in Imago to Brazil. I mean, I've been to Brazil a long time ago. And there what we've done is we found partners, both on the implementation side and on the investigative academic side, which will, where we feel there is the trust. And we have someone who's a mid-career student, who's an ex-minister, who's also been very much facilitating this and finding potential partners where the spirit is not, oh, we're going to evaluate you, we're going to test you, but we are going to help you to give structures and techniques which will help you learn. And anyway, that's absolutely essential to the philosophy. We want to learn, but it's really helping the implementer solve problems through learning and exploration. I would say another thing, when we can describe the difference between this and an RCT, but we should always think about this as a journey. And I think some of the classic development innovations, I mean, from a completely different field, conditional cash transfers. One of the architects of that was Santiago Levy in Mexico. It's become famous partly because they had the foresight, partly investigative, partly tactical, to put RCTs, actually not from the very beginning, but from early on. But I think what he and his team did when they were exploring, looking at all the literature, building the descriptive knowledge and doing some prototyping, they converted what was initially a complex problem with loads of behavioral interactions into what we like to call a complicated problem, where you've got lots of technical interactions where we have clear individual hypotheses, or possibly two hypotheses, where you've got in the lingo 2 treatment arms, maybe 3 treatment arms, which could be tested by an RCT. And that journey is, I think, one that is often going to be the case. Or alternatively, you may start with something very focused, as in where an RCT does make sense, as in something else we're actually just getting into now, which is very famous program, is the BRAC design, the ultra poor program, which is providing intensive support, including capital support, to some of the poorest in the village, with a lot of mentoring and so on, which actually BRAC developed in an exploratory way, prototyping what works, what doesn't work. Then there was a sequence of RCTs across many countries, which showed that in most cases, when implemented intensively, it works. Now they're going to scale. And actually, in Imago, we've just been working with the group that have been given resources to scale, because it's very exciting if it can work. Now they're going to scale. We're back to another complex problem. And how to help them on this game, because you're taking something that you know works, has been shown to work in RCTs against, village against village or group against group, into a system. So here's something where the route is the other route. This initial prototyping exploration, RCTs against when it's become at the technical level, and then back to a complex problem where they will need an adaptive evaluation process as it goes to scale.
That's a lot to unpack there, but I liked how you described first the process of, and I think that is integral to an adaptive evaluation, which is the approach of working closely with the implementing partner, sort of being engaged throughout the process, and working alongside the implementers in some ways, uh, on the same team or within the same team. That really struck me, and I think the last few examples spoke more to how there's like, in a way, adaptive evaluation is not distinct from an RCT, but like complementary and part of a longer journey of exploration. And I wanted to ask you about that more specifically, because there is a lot of debate in impact evaluation on, RCTs or no RCTs, and there are camps sometimes that are, on both sides of the debate in development that are, fairly strong in their criticism or support. And so I was wondering where you stand on this, and where does adaptive evaluation fit in all of this?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, that's a pretty dumb debate. I mean, it's understandable. It's understandable because the RCT movement was part of what they sometimes call the Empirical Revolution in economics, which was not only about RCTs, it's about many other ways of sort of looking at what's happening in the world and then building your interpretation from that, which is fantastic. You're hugely important shift from saying we're going to theorize and that's how the world works. Now, because it became so effective in the areas that it worked on, that there was, I think, some not so much overuse of it, but there are two things I think that were an issue. One is some of the donors and others saying, we want to have evaluations and the gold standard is an RCT. So if you don't have an RCT, you're dealing in the unrigorous phase. Now, that's the wrong way to think about it. For certain kinds of questions, yes. For questions that are amenable to, that are what we call technical questions, that can be tackled, where you're really testing a hypothesis in some equivalent of a lab-like setting, where you're really testing conceptually against the counterfactual of an intervention not happening, but you have to compare one group against the other. For that, it is the gold standard. But it's the gold standard for one kind of question. And there's a load of other questions which it would actually be a mistake and actually costly to use an RCT. You'll be only looking at one part of the system and you'll be learning stuff, but you wouldn't be interpreting what we really want to understand in terms of system change. It can be, I mean, some RCT instruments, A/B testing is a very specific form of RCT. That can be built into the process of adaptive design, but you should, again, never think that if you're in the process of prototyping and exploration, that it has to be done with A/B testing. And that's not the way the private sector thinks. They will sometimes get to A/B testing, especially in the tech world, where it's you can always use it when it's useful. But otherwise, when you think of how private sector works on kind of sprints, it's intensive exploration, work out, and then try it out, but not necessarily in a randomized context. That part of the process it would be inefficient to use an RCT. You would want to use it at some other point. So the quick answer is, I love RCTs for the right question, but you should never think that because RCTs are very good for some kinds of questions, that is the ideal that should always be used. You should think, what is the nature of the problem? What is the nature of the question? And which techniques are useful for applying that? I think what we are doing now is trying to help people understand and think through that in a systematic way. So it's not just a question of, here's some nice techniques you could use. It's when we face a development problem, it's a structured way of thinking, well, what kind of problem is this? What kind of technique makes sense? What approach makes sense? And then within that, which techniques would be appropriate? Is it a process of exploratory design? Is it a process of tracking over time? Are we working at scale, but there's lots going on and you want to look at the diversity and you use techniques of where you look at some of the outliers and you investigate those in depth. They call it positive deviance analysis. And you do that systematically. You say, well, what's going on? Why is that better? And then let's take what's better and then try it out on others, on other parts of the system. And so again, parts of that, there may be scope for randomization or may not, but you shouldn't, it would be a big mistake to say you should always aim for that.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense and is very aligned, I think, with how you've been describing adaptive evaluation and all the examples you gave with Pratham and other ones where it's really a journey of exploration, and it's about mapping techniques to the context. And I guess that's why I wanted to ask you, I guess, and maybe I should have started with this, is how did you come up with the name adaptive evaluation? Where does the adaptive come from? And what are we adapting to?
Yeah, good question. I think adaptive came from two sources. One, that the evaluator is adapting to what we discover in the field, which is actually also some of colleagues and friends who do RCTs absolutely do that too. But we want to make that explicit. We're adapting to what exists there and adapting to the process. And secondly, adaptive in the second sense, that we're supporting a process of the implementer in terms of adapting designs over time to discovery of what works. So these are complementary. And in both cases, we thought, well, adaptive kind of describes that. So let's use this term because and we want to name it as a systematic approach, not just something that is either informal or whatever. And so that's why we chose it.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, for me, the adaptive speaks to a lot of the experimentation, like the cycle of innovation, the prototyping and experimentation and sort of learning, but also adapting to the context and like the situation and applying techniques to the context. But I wanted to ask you one thing. So Imago does a lot of work on innovation and scaling, and like that's sort of the foundation in which Imago sort of built itself. And a lot of work on scaling with various clients. So how do you see, what is the application of adaptive evaluations in innovation and in scaling, and how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because we started thinking, well, our DNA is understanding scaling from the grassroots, tackling especially the missing middle. And over time, we came to realize that the way we work, in addition to the accompaniment, reciprocity, co-creation, is using techniques of design thinking, system diagnosis, and then within that, scaling. And what we've discovered over time is, as we come to interpret it, that the adaptive evaluation is actually a very strong complement to that whole design system thinking, scaling process. So actually, we're now seeing that our vision of how you scale and adaptive evaluation are strong complements. And we've kind of, just as we discovered that design thinking techniques are, yeah, that's actually part of our DNA, we've come to discover that when we're interpreting adaptive, oh, that's part of our DNA and actually fits almost as a strong complement to when we're working on design and implementation.
Perfect. So I have two last questions, but maybe we can keep it to one. So I was curious about a lot of the design thinking and stuff comes from the private sector, and so I was wondering what can development learn from the private sector? That was the first question. The second one was more about Imago, and as you mentioned, you're currently working on projects in adaptive evaluation. What are some of the challenges? What are some of the challenges in doing it, and what does it take to get this engagement from stakeholders and do this kind of research? Yeah, those were the two questions I had.
Okay, so on the first, I've never worked in the private sector, but especially in this last several years working in Imago, I've come to see there's so much that the private sector does that we can learn from. And often what we do is we work with private sector people. We have private sector people on our board. We bring people from the private sector. We've got somebody who spent her career working on marketing, I think in a big cosmetics firm, who's advising us now on how to do the work for the marketing of, say, with social enterprise, the one I referred to earlier called Rudy, marketing spices. And that is already, we see a very tight linkage. The we're in the middle of a process now where beyond the design thinking, we came to the view that our understanding of sprints and agile that kind of became most sharply articulated in the tech sector, and then it spread in the private sector, that a version of that can be adapted to what is needed, whether it's in social enterprises or in the government. Now, of course, you're often working, especially in the government, against that culture. But that is why when we engage with Sarah, we think we can do agile for the grassroots, and it's going to look different, but we're taking some of those ideas of exploratory design, test, and innovate, which others in the development community are also seeking to explore that way, including colleagues in the Kennedy School. In the government, it's tougher, but there, it actually relates to your second question, which is, what does it mean for how we work in Imago? Is absolutely, you can only start on that if you, we're not only looking for some of the tough problems, but we're looking for partners to work with. And that can range from partners who are highly motivated kind of social enterprises, highly motivated NGOs or grassroots organizations, but groups in the government that are also in an exploration. And my general view of take the much maligned Indian government, often accused of being, incompetent, corrupt, and whatever. I don't have that view. Of course, there's some of that, but I have the view that often, and all the government people that I've worked with, that I've taught, we often have government people come to us, and also the careful analysis of government behavior by the more sociological or anthropological types takes me that a lot of the issue is government people want to solve problems, but they are within the system. So also there you can find counterparts who are interested, who want to learn what does and doesn't work. And actually, to go back for a moment, for part of Pratan's engagement in learning, a lot of that has been precisely finding groups in government who want to work and explore in that way, which we weren't involved in that part except as an evaluator. And that's the way we, from initial discussions with Brazilian counterparts, these are counterparts in government who want to solve problems, in this case, coming out of COVID in the education system. And so this is why, what we say is, look, we want to help you in an approach that originally comes from the private sector, but that you can do in a different way. You can do it in a different way, and which, from our viewpoint, involves you building that trust and collaboration without which you cannot start.
Yes, thank you so much, Michael. I could keep asking questions, and this is such a exciting space and something I'm passionate about, and I know you're very passionate about, and I can see it. But thank you so much for the interview, and this is an emerging topic, and I like to think of adaptive as not just in evaluations, but in life and in nature and otherwise. So yeah, so it's good to hear.
We have to have a personal adaptive spirit to engage in this.
Yes, most certainly. Well, thank you so much.
Great, thank you.